To a grand projet that you might have noticed Newsnight has developed a fondness for discussing. Yes, it's London's fraught plans for a garden bridge. Today, the National Audit Office has said that the government ministers have repeatedly handed over public money against official advice. Here's Hannah Barnes.
The idea at the heart of the garden bridge is for Londoners to have a peaceful, beautiful way to cross the River Thames on foot. There's been opposition to this idea from the very beginning. Some say it's just a vanity project of Boris Johnson and of the former Chancellor George Osborne. But as the costs have crept up, it's currently £185 million, and as revealed by Newsnight, the funding shortfall has grown. Those concerns are being felt more widely. Today, the National Audit Office has disclosed that right at the outset, officials in the Department for Transport thought there was a significant risk that the garden bridge would prove poor value for money for the taxpayer. Despite that, ministers ploughed ahead, agreeing to fund the project to the tune of £30 million. That cash for the garden bridge is on top of another £30 million from Transport for London. The concerns about value for money, though, meant that the government initially placed a cap on how much could be spent before building work started. But we learned today they upped it on 3 separate occasions. The Department for Transport's financial exposure, or how much they'd lose if the garden bridge failed, increased from an original £8.2 million to a whopping £28.5 million in May. It's slightly lower than that now because the new Transport Secretary reduced the amount of cancellation costs he was prepared to cover. That initial big jump in exposure was too much for top officials. Having already advised against an earlier upping of the cap, this time round, Transport's most senior civil servant sought a so-called ministerial direction, when they asked ministers to take specific responsibility for a decision they don't agree with. Philip Rutnam wrote to the then Transport Secretary Patrick McLaughlin expressing his concerns.
The Department for Transport has been asked to increase its pre-construction exposure by up to £15 million to underwrite the potential cancellation liabilities. In my judgment, this represents a disproportionate level of exposure for the Exchequer to the risk of failure on a charity-led project that was intended to be funded largely by private donations.
A civil servant asking for ministerial direction isn't common. A recent example was over the funding of children's charity Kids Company. But despite concerns raised by his top officials, the then Transport Secretary Patrick McLaughlin agreed to put a further £15 million of taxpayers' money potentially on the line. His reasoning? That failure to underwrite the garden bridge would increase the risk of it failing altogether. And if that happened, the £35 million of public money already spent would be gone.
The one big question that remains unanswered is why was it so important for this project to go ahead? We've got officials at the Department for Transport telling us it's not a transport project, it's high risk, it's poor value for money, and they were repeatedly overruled by ministers. And what we don't know is why it was given so much priority.
We may not know the answer to that yet, but today's report leaves little doubt about the difficulties facing the garden bridge. There remains, the NAO says, a significant risk that the project will not go ahead.